I was super disturbed by some TikToks that I was seeing about IVF. I know I have tons of friends, not tons of friends, but I know a couple of people that have gone through the IVF journey. So don't worry, you're not going to be insulted by this in any way. I know how critical for some people that are really just trying to have one child and how emotional that journey can be. But I also do think and feel in my heart that we are on the brink of an awakening in American society. I think people are just starting to notice a lot of evil today in a way that feels almost like there's a quickening of sorts happening. And I'm just hopeful that if people hear me say this, they will at least begin their own journey. Because one of the reasons why so much evil has been allowed to happen in America is because they're editing history in real time, right? The ADL, Wikipedia, all of this exists not to actually educate you, but to give you a very shallow interpretation of history as they slowly modify it and make it very difficult to find any real information, because real information exists in books still. And so they're able to make you think that you are looking something up and becoming educated, when in reality, what they're doing is slowly brainwashing you. So a token of your education is actually you being brainwashed, hence the public education system altogether, where we're now learning that 40% of students in America cannot pass a basic reading test. That is intentional, right? Because they want these students to graduate and think that they're smart, when in reality, they don't even have the capacity to be able to read a historical book and to understand how we got to these certain circumstances in America. Anyways, going back to how this relates to IVF, I was very shocked to see women, even doctors, getting on there. And there was one woman who was like, I'm a doctor. She's talking to people on TikTok, and she's like, I just can't believe they're doing this. Like, this is literally the state trying to control my body.
It's always been about control over women, their bodies, and their reproductive choices.
Like, such a talking point. The state trying to control my body because Alabama is saying that an embryo is a child. So this is what they're upset about on TikTok, that Alabama said an embryo is a child. And another TikToker was saying, like, what if I can't afford to store all my embryos? Like, why can't I just, I guess, throw them out? If you're saying it's now a child, this is actually going to sort of set women back economically.
What about embryos that now need to be permanently stored, but people can't afford to? Are those embryos now going to be up for adoption to people who want them? Could there be a little you running around somewhere because you couldn't afford to store your embryo? And don't forget, there are plenty of birth controls that impede implantation. Are those now going to be considered some sort of murder device? And don't forget that about 15% of fertilized eggs don't actually implant, and they just pass with your cycle. So now is it going to be considered murder if you get your period?
And I'm watching these TikToks, and I am just shook by looking in people's eyes and realizing that they're serious when they say these things, because they don't know anything about the history of the women's movement, the history of the propaganda that they're even saying, and how much it all derives from a very dark chapter known as the Progressive Era, where there was a panic in America, and the people that were super educated caused the panic. A bunch of Yale and Harvard grads, a man named Madison Grant and Francis Galton, working together, producing a book essentially called The Passing of the Great Race. And they believed that because dumb people, immorally defective people were breeding, that ultimately it was going to harm the Nordic supreme race. That they believed, like, if you were from the Nordic countries, you were the brightest person, you were the best people, and it was a form of Darwinism. Francis Galton was actually related to Charles Darwin, and they had to deal with it. So they came up with the idea of birth control, literally not hiding that, right? Birth control. And obviously, if you said to people, we are trying to exterminate you so that you can't produce a lot of children, people would not have wanted to take birth control. So Margaret Sanger and her friends came up with an idea that, you know what, why don't we work on birth control propaganda? You can actually look this up, because Margaret Sanger wrote an essay called Birth Control Propaganda. She's written a ton of essays, and they're now trying to wipe them off of the internet, because you probably learned in school that she was a hero. She was a monster and a psycho who was also quite smart, and they started working on how they could convince people to sterilize themselves. At this time in America, there were actually sterilization colonies and clinics. So they started opening hospitals, institutions, so to speak. And if you were a woman and you got pregnant and you were unmarried, you went into the institution and they would sterilize you. They had court cases, notoriously Buck versus Bell. And the state said, yes, no, some people are so morally defective, they should be sterilized. We're talking about literally, if you were a woman who got pregnant and you didn't have a husband, they would be like, no, into the institution you go. And so Margaret Sanger became friendly with all of the great thinkers of her time, most notably, I think Dr. Clarence Gamble, who Gamble as in Procter & Gamble, that family. He turned 21. He inherited $1 million, and he wanted to put that money to work by sterilizing people. And he wrote extensively about this need to sterilize the population, or there would be too many stupid people, right? So the propaganda that they came up with was, let's tell people it's about women's health. They were especially focused on sterilizing Black Americans in the South because they were like, they're having kids too quickly. And they started creating birth control. Like, this is how the story goes. They started creating birth control with the understanding that it would sterilize people long term. And they started experimenting on people that were institutionalized. Women were showing signs of depression. Some women killed themselves. Some women died because they got cancer. And guess what? The FDA still said, this is a go. We're going to go on with this. They were also experimenting on that at that time on Africans in another continent. This is the creation of all of these NGOs pretending to care about people. They even had something called the Population Council, which still exists, unbelievably, where they were just examining how they were going to control the population. So you wake up today and you know that Dr. Clarence Gamble and Margaret Sanger were opening these clinics to sterilize people. They didn't change the birth control medicine. This is still the medicine that we have today. And she wrote, like literally wrote once to him, like, we don't want word to get out that we want to exterminate the race. But, you know, let's maybe make an appeal to the ministers and the churches to help us with this propaganda, with this message. You know, the birth control propaganda is, it's going to make you free. It's going to make you free, woman. And, you fast forward to today and you realize that women don't know this. And I come across women and they're dosing themselves every day with hormones, and they're getting all sorts of stuff. They're getting, cancer. They don't know they're right on the label. It says, this is an increased chance of breast cancer. They don't know that. And historically, it's always been known that this was going to give you cancer. You get hormones every day. It's always been known this is going to be a possibility, that obviously there is a direct correlation between hormones and cancer when your hormones are not regulated correctly. Women don't even know what birth control is. They don't even know that it controls your brain. Like, actually, it's convincing your brain that you're pregnant so that you don't menstruate, right? They don't even know that on the FDA inserts, it says that it can lead to liver cancer, cervical cancer. All the things are right there in front of them. Diabetes. I mean, it's just, so I see so many women say that are sick, depression, suicide, all of these things. And it never dawns on women, because this is what happens with the disappearance of a true education, that you are making yourself sick. That all of this is on the insert, that you are microdosing yourself every single day with a synthetic hormone, that the state has been successful, that actually birth control was the state's way to control your body, not the other way around. Like, they wanted to control your body. And then you hear women that are saying that they're struggling to have kids. And I'm just going, guys, yeah, that was the point. You're struggling to have kids because that was the point. They didn't want you to have so many kids. So this has been the long game. They have been successful, right? These same people, these same eugenicists were the ones that created the textbooks. The eugenicist families, the Rockefeller family created the textbooks to control what you were learning about your own history. And you learned that this was about freedom. No, this was never about freedom. This was about making sure that you didn't have too many kids. And so it saddens me when I see and I come across people who are struggling to have one kid, struggling to have two kids, and they don't know what's wrong with them. And the doctors who have just given them the birth control for 20 years of their life are now like, oh, I don't know, this is just the way. No, it's not just the way it is. Women shouldn't be struggling to have one or two kids. Like, we have to wake up. This is not normal. None of this is normal, okay? It's a Machiavellian evil design to keep you stupid, to keep you fat. Yes, it also makes you fat. Birth control makes you fat. It decreases your mental health because it's impacting your brain, acne, all of these things, guys. You have to look into the history of this stuff. This is... we tried to sterilize women. Oh, look, women are sterilized. What do we do? Oh, I know. We create another industry, IVF, and we convince women to defend that industry as well. What is more sinister? What is more satanic than the concept of the state eventually one day being able to control life and death, right? IVF, you're going to have to go to the government to have a baby, okay? And then you're going to have to go to the government to die, because now you're hearing them talk about euthanasia. It's a right. It's a right that the government should be allowed to, so people should be allowed. It's about your individual freedom. It's none of those things, guys, okay? It's none of those things. You already gave up control over your bodies. It's happening in the classroom. You're being brainwashed as a woman when you are way too young to make those sorts of decisions. Long-term implications, copper IUDs in your body. So insane. This is an actual fact that Margaret Sanger bailed out a Jewish OBGYN from prison in Nazi Germany because she wanted him to come over because he had created the first IUD. And she was like, that's great. And they opened a birth control clinic going after low-income families in New York. He's Grafenberg. Look him up. You ever heard of G-Spot? Ernst Grafenberg? You have him to thank for that. And then go look into the studies of how women, when they tested the Ernst Grafenberg's first, IUD that was on the market, of what happened to those women. And then ask yourself how the FDA, after years and years, just keeps confirming these products. We are making ourselves sick mentally and physically. And I just need you to know that when women have that crazed look in their eye and they start talking about the state's going to control their bodies, that it is an utter inversion of the truth, okay? Actually, we need to go back to the state not controlling our bodies. I am against birth control, personally. I've always known something was suspect about it. I'm glad I had that innate thing. I am against really all drugs, honestly. When you look into it and the history of how they get confirmed by the FDA, you will realize that there is a medical cartel and they benefit by keeping us sick.